So welcome everyone to this roundtable, Where Next for Local Government Audit Reform. My name is Fanny. I'm from Research for Action, which is a worker cooperative producing research to further economic, social and environmental justice. There are some of my colleagues in the room too. Maybe Vika and Joel, you can give a little wave. And there are also people we have collaborated with, and of course we have an excellent lineup of speakers today on this topic, and I will introduce the speakers more in due course when it's their turn to speak. So yeah, like I said already, if you are happy to introduce yourselves in the chat, please go ahead. And before we go further, I wanted to say the usual Zoom practicalities. If you please could keep yourselves on mute when you're not speaking, just to reduce the background noise, that would be appreciated. And we will be recording this event. So if you don't want to appear on the recording, that will be published, please feel free to keep your cameras off. So yes, with Research for Action, we recently published research that has examined the use of public rights under the Local Audit and Accountability Act. And our findings, which my co-author Megan Waugh will tell you more about very shortly, show a serious lack of accountability in local government. Residents' concerns were dismissed by auditors, despite those same auditors having behind-the-scenes conversations with regulators and central government about how to account for the financial instruments that residents were concerned about. We really believe that the weaknesses in current local government audit arrangements contribute to a deficit in oversight and failure to consider the public interest. Private audit firms that are supposed to scrutinize councils act in consultancy roles for them, as well as companies that authorities have contracts with. And this is compounded with a fragmented oversight structure where no regulatory body is willing to intervene even though residents are raising concerns across the country. And it's not only our work that's been recently sounding the alarm about local audit. The National Audit Office has recognized that there are long-standing problems with local audit, and the Public Accounts Committee has currently an ongoing inquiry into the timeliness of local audit following a financial year where over half of local authorities' accounts in England were signed off late. There's also a growing recognition for the need for audit reform in the private sector after audit failure has contributed to several high-profile bankruptcies in the 2000s. Despite the commonality of the issues, there has been no such focus on public sector audit, for instance, local audit. And even the white paper on audit reform that the government is currently consulting on only mentions local audits on 2 pages of over 200. So local audit needs to be more than an afterthought, which is why we have brought together this roundtable of experts on audit and accountability. We aim to start a dialogue between stakeholders who are calling for improved audits in private and public sectors. We want to raise awareness of public sector audit failure and work towards recommendations for reform. The boundaries between public and private audits are blurred anyway in a context where local government is increasingly outsourced and privatized. After our speakers, there will be time for discussion, and we hope to touch on the reform agenda as the white paper consultation is currently ongoing, and including oversight and regulation, but also more widely on the themes around what principles should underline public audit and what the role for the public should and could be in that. So now to kick us off after this introduction, I will pass to Megan, who is working with Research for Action on this. Megan is also a PhD researcher at the University of Leeds and has written on public accountability rights and collaborated with People versus PFI.
Okay, am I on? Okay, hi. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the work behind our recently published report, Democracy Denied, Audit and Accountability Failure in Local Government. In this report, we look at the public rights which are part of the 2014 Local Audit and Accountability Act. This legislation marks several key changes which have impacted on local audit and on the ability of the public to engage with local audit accountability processes. Firstly, and most significantly, obviously, it was the abolition of the Audit Commission and the introduction of private auditors into local audit. A major justification for this dramatic change in local audit arrangements related to cost cutting, and audit fees have since been cut by as much as 40%. This is something that was very quickly identified by local authorities and various parliamentary reviews and inquiries as having a detrimental impact on the quality and scope of local audit. And in terms of public accountability rights, the right to inspect and object to a council's accounts, the legislation has also limited public access to information which could be deemed commercially sensitive, and it has created restrictions on sharing information as well as removing sanctions against anyone obstructing the public exercising these rights. As Fanny mentioned, and as I'm sure most people here are well aware, there have been multiple reviews and parliamentary inquiries which identify the need for an evaluation of the new audit regime, as well as the potential risks of a weakened local audit regime. And the first quote you can see here from the Kingman Review into the FRC summarises exactly this point. Inquiries and reviews looking more specifically at local audit have identified the use of public rights as an indicator of the health of the audit regime. And at the same time, it's been acknowledged that no data on these rights is centrally gathered, and therefore very little is currently understood about their use, about how many objections are investigated, or even what issues are being raised across the country. Our work is the only review that has so far taken place looking at how public rights in relation to local audit are functioning. So very briefly, the public rights we're discussing cover the rights of residents and other interested parties to inspect council's accounts and related documents, and of local electors to ask the auditor questions and object to issues of public interest in the accounts. We analysed 155 uses of the rights, and these comprised 83 objections and 72 attempts to inspect council's accounts across 46 different local authorities in England and Scotland. The majority of these objections related either to LOBO loans or PFI schemes. Both of these are subjects of significant public interest and have been the focus of numerous parliamentary inquiries and investigations, ongoing media coverage, as well as a number of legal cases. The vast majority of the objections we were involved in were dealt with by three main audit firms, KPMG, EY, and Grant Thornton. So briefly, what we found in relation to local authorities was that they did not meet their obligations to allow the public to inspect their accounts in a way that could inform the objection process. They failed to publicise inspection rights as required by the legislation and often did not seem to even understand them, frequently treating inspection requests under the Freedom of Information Act. They took months to respond, sometimes up to a year, making it impossible to file objections based on any information gathered. And even after legislation was introduced, which allowed journalists and citizen journalists to inspect accounts, local authorities continued to question the interested person's right to inspect. They also made narrow and obstructive interpretations of the related documents which could be inspected, and information was often provided in impenetrable formats, and in other instances, authorities insisted on personal visits to inspect documents at the town hall rather than making data available online. The most significant and concerning finding in relation to the auditors and objections was that no action was taken. In around a third of cases, auditors did not even respond. And when they did, it took so long, an average of 2 years and as much as 4 in one case, that any contemporaneous intervention was rendered impossible. The quality of investigation and responses we did see was of a consistently poor standard. Auditors didn't respond to arguments made and produced no evidence of their own to support their decisions. In many instances, their responses revealed a lack of sector-specific knowledge, something that was highlighted in the recent Redmond Review into oversight of local audit. And despite all of this, we discovered many auditors were also charging local authorities additional fees for their work on objections, sometimes up to tens of thousands of pounds. Simon from Lambeth People's Audit is going to talk later about the problems he's faced when trying to appeal or complain about the objection process. But I just wanted to comment on some of the recurring frustrations expressed by objectors that we worked with about the responses they received. or didn't receive. They often were confused about where or how they should appeal or complain, or felt frustrated that it would have little impact even if they did. Others felt intimidated that an appeal could end up being a costly legal exercise. And as this quote highlights, the absence of a clear appeal system effectively serves to undermine the existence of their rights. Our report has made a series of recommendations, some of them quite specific about certain aspects of the legislation, but I'd like to end with a few reflections on what we found. These accountability rights are clearly not functioning as they should, and as a result, public scrutiny is being frustrated at every turn rather than enabled. Citizens exercising these rights, even in relation to issues of significant public interest, are being treated as an inconvenience and a problem. And it is our experience that the public interest is currently being very narrowly defined by private interests. We believe the public has a role to play in local audit and local democracy, but are currently being excluded. And this is of particular concern in a context where we are also witnessing local audit being squeezed out of discussions about wider audit reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And if anybody wants to know more about our research, just contact us, and we can definitely, the report is available on our website, and we can even send you a paper copy if you'd prefer that. Next, we are delighted to introduce Prem Sika, who is Emeritus Professor of Accounting at Essex Business School, as well as a peer in the House of Lords. So Lord Sika. It's probably fair to say that he is one of the leading voices for audit reform, not just academically, but also in policy terms. And he has written extensively on accountancy firms, business accountability, and the regulatory architecture around audit. So over to you, Prem.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Fanny, for organising this event and your excellent report. Like many other people, I have a neglected focus on local audits, so I learned quite a lot by reading this. I also, since I saw the initial draft, I've spoken to some number of other individuals, including some involved with regulation. And I found that the regulatory structure is utterly unsatisfactory. Here, already been mentioned the Audit Commission. Audit Commission was abolished at the behest of the big accounting firms who put in about £3.5 million in donations to the Conservative Party in the period leading to the 2010 general election. And their reward was the eventual abolition of the Audit Commission, because in those days, a lot of local council audits were carried out by the district auditors, and the big accounting firms hardly got a look in, and they were not really happy about this. So they basically maneuvered and persuaded the government to abolish the Audit Commission. Publicly, they tell us that the Audit Commission has been replaced by Public Sector Audit Appointments Limited, which is a subsidiary of something called the Improvement and Development Agency, which itself is owned by the Local Government Association. So it's quite a maze there. But the PSAA is not really a regulator. It is at best an organization concerned with procurement of an audit. So local councils, as I understand it, had an option. They could either appoint their own auditors directly or as it were, subcontract the appointment and remuneration of auditors to PSAA. So PSAA can appoint auditors and also remunerate them, and that money is collected through a levy. PSAA at the moment has about 480 clients, which is what they like to call them, and it appoints auditors from a list of accredited auditors. These are inevitably generally big accounting firms, because they were the ones who wanted really to get into the specialized markets. And any organization which is accredited by an audit regulator, such as the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, is considered to be accredited. Now you can appreciate here that the ICAW is actually a trade association. It really represents the interests of the big accounting firms and accountants at large. It is not really concerned with the welfare of the citizens or value for money for local council taxpayers. So any organization accredited by the ICAW is considered to be accredited. So the PSAA does not set auditing standards for local authorities. It does not set accounting standards for them either. The National Audit Office prepares what they call the audit guidelines for, hopefully somebody's counting the number of bodies involved here, quite a lot of them. So the National Audit Office prepares the audit guidelines, and otherwise auditors are expected to follow international auditing standards, but the NAO has no representation on the FRC board. So it is completely outside it. So that means the FRC or its successor body, ARGA as it is being called, has no representation from the NAO. Following the Redmond review, the FRC and its successor body will oversee the quality of local audits. But again, the question is, what is the benchmark being used to assess that quality? The answer is, it is really, in general, the auditing standards used by the commercial firms to audit commercial entities, whereas local authorities are not commercial entities. They have entirely different purpose. Again, we have a mess here. The mess is that if an audit exceeds, if the entity being audited has a revenue of more than £500 million, then it comes under the remit of the FRC. If it is less than 500 million, then it is not under the FRC, but by an accrediting body such as the ICAW. So you have a situation, 1 year council is subject to the ICAW oversight, a council audit is subject to ICAW oversight, another year it is the FRC, and it is going up and down, and that is simply a huge problem. So local councils can also appoint their own auditors as long as they have an independent audit panel. That is what I've been told. And you already referred to the problem of the consultancy fees. Now, if there are complaints about, as Megan said, about the conduct of the audit or behavior of the audit, the question is, where do you go? Well, it really depends whether the audit firm is subject to the ICAW oversight or now the FRC oversight. But that is the first thing anybody will have to find out. And if there are fines, what actually happens to those fines? Would they be used to improve a benefit for the local citizens, or will they be used simply to swell the coffers of the ICAW, FRC, or the Treasury? So local authorities, I looked at some accounts yesterday and today. It is surprising how many of them are using international financial reporting standards. Now, what on earth are international financial reporting standards got to do with the conduct of local authorities? They're entirely different. So lots of those accounting standards are aimed at capital markets and for the welfare or the information of shareholders. Indeed, if you look on the accounting frameworks behind that, they say that the purpose of financial reporting is to enable investors to make assessments of future cash flows. There are no investors here. It is an entirely different setup. So there is a misspecification of accounting and auditing here. When you look at the so-called going concern problems, whether they were at BHS, Carillion, London Capital Finance, or Patisserie Valerie or somewhere else, their going concern problems stem from their business model. Whereas when you look at local authorities, there are entirely different kind of concerns. For example, it's to do with government funding. It's to do with the local economy and whether you can collect business rates or not. It's to do with local levels of employment, entirely different kind of issues. And inevitably there is a focus, as your report identifies, on things like local authority budgets, which citizens want to have a look at, and the outturns. And that itself is, so to my mind, there are problems because the wrong tools are being used. Then when auditors do the audit, they use a materiality threshold. They consider whether something is really significant. Now, so started looking at some of these accounts, as I said, for the last few days. And in one local authority audit, there is a mention that the auditors have considered a materiality level to be £13 million. 13 million, that's crazy. Why this ballpark figure? I have no idea. Now, when auditors select materiality numbers, they're primarily thinking about the risk of lawsuits to themselves, especially from commercial operators like investors and financial institutions. So the auditor's approach to materiality there is driven by those kind of commercial concerns. Whereas when we are looking at local authorities, for example, materiality is, are you delivering the service? Are you able to provide the local services which the citizens have mandated? So it is an entirely different kind of a setup here. And so just think about it. If a local council has an annual income of, say, 100 million, and you're using 13 million as a materiality threshold, how many items will you actually be looking at? Not many. Who on earth is going to be giving you 13 million, for example, in council tax? And obviously, if you got expenditure and your own staffing, there may well be issue about 13 million, but many of the purchases are going to be less than 13 million. So that to me was quite a shock, that this kind of a mechanical approach being applied. And again, talking to some individuals involved in the coalface of audit, I asked them about it, and the response was, we don't know. This is decided by our firm and we are simply given instructions. So
sorry, Prem, 1 minute warning.
Okay, thank you. So I think what I'm trying to indicate is that the government's privatization, as it were, of the local authority audits has not really been accompanied by the design of appropriate tools. And if anything, the problems are multiplying, and also these firms are not used to public accountability questions, which is what your report indicates. And I'm sure we will have a chat later on about these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prem, for all that insight. I'm sure we will touch on those themes both in the discussion, and I know that we will touch on them in some of the coming presentations. Next, we move to the world of local audit specifically. Gillian Fawcett is co-founder of the non-profit Public Finance by Women, as well as a freelance consultant in public policy, strategy and finance. Her previous positions include Head of International at CIPFA, Head of Public Sector at ACCA Global, Senior Fellow within the Organizational Development and Policy Team at the Office of Public Management, Head of Finance at the Scrutiny Unit in the House of Commons, and she was also Head of Policy at the Audit Commission before it was abolished. So over to you, Gillian.
Thank you, Fanny, and thank you for inviting me to this, I think, really sort of timely debate about audit. It doesn't seem to go away, particularly local government audit. Before I begin to outline my views about local government audit or the local government audit landscape, I just want to sort of give some context in terms of what the scope of audit covers in local government, because I think a lot of people don't fully understand this. There's a wider scope of audit in local government than there is, for example, in the private sector. So whilst financial audit in both the private sector and public sector are more or less generally the same, there's a wider scope in the public sector and for local government that covers value for money. So auditors have a responsibility to look for economy, at the arrangements for economy, efficiency and effectiveness. And they've also got the additional responsibilities to what Megan has outlined in terms of to hear objections and have responsibilities over issuing public interest reports where there are serious failings in councils. So there's a much wider scope, and I would argue that that's because there's a greater accountability imperative within the public sector. So, for example, if your local authority services are performing poorly, you can't stop paying your council tax unless you want to go to prison. But in the private sector, if the company isn't doing so well, you can take out your investment and invest elsewhere. I mean, also arguably in the public sector, you have the opportunity to diselect the ruling party at the next elections, but that could be 3 or 5 years that you'd suffer poor performing services. So that's my view in terms of why there's a greater accountability imperative for the public sector. So thinking about that context, and as Prem's alluded to, 2015 saw the final days of the Audit Commission. And it took well over 5 years to actually disentangle the functions of the Audit Commission and find them a new home. So those that were making the decisions at that time didn't fully understand audit and audit of the public sector, which extended beyond local government. So they actually didn't understand what they were doing at the time. And the abolition was undertaken at great cost to the taxpayer. And also what you saw was a leakage of a highly skilled and expert workforce, which were dedicated to public sector audit. So what have we got now? So we're, 6 years since the abolition of the Audit Commission. So we've basically got a mishmash of structures and functions for local government audit. So to put it another way, if you were to design a system of audit now, you wouldn't design it like this for local government. And from a public point of view, it's very, very difficult to know how to navigate the system, or where your first port of call is, or what we've heard in terms of how to actually navigate an appeals process. So it's been much more sort of frustrated by that. And as Prem has alluded to, so just briefly in terms of what actually happened with those functions following the demise of the Audit Commission. So we still have a limited market of audit firms within local government, and I haven't got time to go into why that is the case, but it is still limited. And this was one of the concerns that was outlined by the Select Committee back in 2000, as far back as 2011. You have the Public Sector Audit Appointments Organisation, which is wholly owned by the LGA, which, as Prem outlined, is responsible for letting and managing the contracts for principal audits, principal local government audits. And for the smaller audits, you have another body that is responsible for commissioning those audits. So you've got two bodies operating here, but not as regulators. In relation to that wider audit coverage, in terms of, I don't know, some of you may remember the National the Audit Commission National Value for Money studies. Well, those have been pared down. They're now undertaken by the National Audit Office, which incidentally doesn't have a remit over local government for audit, but is producing National Value for Money reports. But it does have a remit over the Code of Audit Practice for local government. And that code is the Bible for audits, in that it sets out the approach and principles for auditors to take in local government audits. So it covers, for example, the actions auditors should take in dealing with objections and public interest reports, as well as conducting other parts of the audit. But even now, the Code of Audit Practice is going to be passed on to the new body, which is going to precede the Financial Reporting Council. So that is going to ACRA, which is the Audit Reporting and Governance Authority. But prior to that, the FRC had responsibility over monitoring the quality of local government audits. And as we've seen, in terms of that, tended to be an add-on for the FRC. It sort of accumulated that particular function. But as we've seen with the Tony Redmond review, audit quality has been relatively poor. And indeed, the PSSA, the letting of new contracts, there's been a shift now, or there's going to be a shift in terms of away from cost, more towards quality. But what in respect of fraud and corruption? Well, no harm was found for fraud and corruption. The Audit Commission did a lot of valuable work in this area. So that was hived off between CIPFA and the Cabinet Office. And I believe that is still the case. As for inspection, inspection is now with the Local Government Association as part of a sector-led improvement body, which consists of peer review. So as you can see, collectively, all of that together is an absolute mismatch and fragmented way to conduct audit and scrutiny for local government. So what's been lost with the Audit Commission? Well, we're missing a candid friend of local government. Some may not see it that way, but generally it was set up to work alongside local government to improve public services. And it was independent. It wasn't accountable to local government, but it was a candid friend. As I've mentioned, we've lost a lot of the expertise and a strong public sector ethos in wanting to improve local government. Some of that expertise has gone to the firms, but a lot is actually dissipated out of the sector. And one thing that I think is critically important, the Audit Commission, unlike creatures such as the National Audit Office, could actually speak out against government policy. So if government policy was particularly poor, it would actually say so. And that's an example of being a candid friend with local government. But also it would pursue rigorously any illegal activity undertaken by local government. And we only have to think, and I think we're going to hear about a little bit about the Westminster case, the Homes for Votes scandal back in the 80s, but also thinking about sort of Hammersmith and Fulham and their dealings with the global financial markets, which would have cost taxpayers thousands of money. So there's quite a lot that we've lost since the abolition. So what needs to change? We've had a number of fundamental reviews, the last review being the Tony Redmond review.
Sorry, Gillian, 1 minute.
1 minute.
Please.
Well, if I've got 1 minute, I would say, well, what we're lacking is systematic leadership over the audit process within local government. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government needs to take a more active role and gather more knowledge about this and actually look to carry out I think, a wider review of governance and audit. So taking into account some of the other structures that overpin governance, internal audit, scrutiny committees, the role of audit committees, public scrutiny, and indeed the mishmash of audit functions that we have now. And I leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Gillian. There's always so much more to say, and it would be wonderful to hear from you more, but we can get to some of those things in the conversation. Definitely a lot of really, really interesting points that you raised there. And like Gillian alluded to, we will next hear a little bit about the Homes for Votes scandal, because we have an intervention now from a last-minute addition to our speakers list. So a surprise to those who have read the event description. Andrew Hoskin, a former BBC journalist who broke the Homes for gerrymandering scandal at Westminster Council, working closely with the Audit Commission, and he has also written a book about it, Nothing Like a Dame. It's great to have you, Andrew, so please go ahead. You are on mute, so you need to unmute.
Can you hear me now? Okay, well, thanks, Fanny. Good morning, everyone. No, I didn't break the Homes for Votes scandal. That was John Ware on Panorama. My claim to fame is that I've found, when I was on the Today programme as a reporter, I found all the money she'd hidden offshore. And after reporting on where the money was, the money was frozen in her bank accounts, and she was eventually forced to pay over £12.3 million, which was somewhat short of the £40 million that she owed the local local council taxpayers of Westminster. So I'm very proud of that. And it was great because actually half of the money, the £6 million, went to pay for the 5-year inquiry that was conducted by the district auditor, John McGill, alongside his excellent companion, Tony Child, who was from the Audit Commission. And the rest of the money, the other £6 million, went on providing social housing in Westminster, which had suffered as a result of the policies of Dame Shirley Porter, who was the leader of the City Council when it embarked on this unlawful policy of gerrymandering. So what happened was that in 1982, the same year the Audit Commission began, was started by Michael Heseltine, who was then the Environment Secretary. The Tories nearly lost their flagship council, Westminster. It included Buckingham Palace, the Palace of Westminster, all these major national institutions. So it was their main flagship, and Dame Shirley Porter was a sort of mini-me Mrs. Thatcher, and was often compared to her. And they realised that there were 8 marginal wards within the city of Westminster that they had to win. I mean, they nearly lost Westminster by 4 seats. 4 seats was the margin. The Labour Party ran a very good campaign in 1982, and the Tories were stunned. So what they did was they introduced a policy called designated sales. And designated sales, they claimed, was across the whole council. So what would happen is that if a council flat became vacant or a council house became vacant, it was sealed up until it could be sold to obviously people more likely to vote Conservative in those 8 marginal areas. Now, they disguised the policy by making it look like it was a borough-wide policy, but it wasn't. It was, as the Audit Commission and the District Auditor found, because they'd written it all down in secret documents, and although people had shredded a lot of them, they hadn't shredded all of them. They found that they had purposefully concentrated those council house sales in those marginal wards. So what happened was, after it was exposed, thanks to the Labour Party actually making an objection to the accounts, there was a 5-year inquiry. And indeed, a lot of people lied to John McGill and Tony Child, but also other people told the truth. And they managed during this extraordinary inquiry to piece together the evidence that was needed to find them guilty of misconduct, which in those days meant that you could be surcharged, and it was a very high bar for proof. It was almost above criminal, and I remember him saying that gerrymandering was a disgraceful and improper purpose, and not a purpose for which a local councillor may act. And initially there were 10 councillors who were provisionally surcharged, and I was at the press conference, I remember, with John McGill. It was quite dramatic. It was such an extraordinary scandal. I think the following day, most national newspapers had the scandal from pages 1 to 10. I mean, people forget it now. I mean, Edward Heath described it as the heaviest blow to hit the Tory party in living memory. I mean, that's 20 odd years ago now, but it was such a huge shock that a council would engage in such a corrupt policy as that. But even then, she was given years and years because there was a happy coincidence that it was the heaviest surcharge in history, and it happened to be one of the richest people ever in local government who was having to pay for it, so she could actually afford it. That was the most extraordinary thing altogether. But it also meant that she had the money to keep on challenging, and it went to there was a hearing by the District Auditor, then it went to the High Court, then it went to the Appeal Court, then it went to the House of Lords, and it was eventually the House of Lords in 2001, I think it was, that said yes, all 5 judges agreed. She was indeed guilty of gerrymandering and was then forced to pay what was a bill of around £40 million. But by that time, she'd effectively hidden most of the loot offshore. And famously, all that was left apparently was a heavily mortgaged flat that she shared with her sister, Irene, with the capital worth £32,000, and a gold-plated lavatory seat. That was the only thing that was left, apparently. But anyway, I won't bore you with how I found the money, but it was a comedy of errors, really. in which her son had
Sorry, Andrew, 1 minute.
1 minute. Which her son had fallen out with a businessman. That businessman got private detectives to hack into his emails illegally, as it happened, and those emails happened to show that Shirley Porter was issuing instructions to him about where to hide the money. And those emails ended up with me in the end, and that's why we managed to sort of put it out in the public arena. So anyway, that's enough boasting from me, but that's hopefully that encapsulates what happened in Westminster and how extraordinary the whole thing was.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for coming on board with short notice and sharing all that with us. It's, yeah, obviously there's a lot of researchers and investigators in this room, so it's also, yeah, really inspiring to hear about a successful breaking of a story, even though I apologize for crediting it wrong with you. We will continue to zoom in to actually another London borough right now, and we will next hear from a resident who has tried to hold his local council to account. The People's Audit in Lambeth in South London is a volunteer-run network of residents who believe local government spending should be open and accountable to local people. They've been scrutinising their local council since 2015, and our report actually also draws on some of their experiences with this place-based citizen audit work. So we will hear from Simon Morrow, whose interest in council spending was triggered by his professional experience as a surveyor, and he has been with the group since the beginning and has years of experience of using the public accountability rights. And he's also tried to, some of the complaints procedures that we have, that a couple of speakers have alluded to, but I will let Simon tell you more himself. Over to you, Simon.
Hi, thanks for letting me speak. So I'm just going to speak briefly about the objection process. I went through the objection process with KPMG and also Mazars. With KPMG, it took 4 years to go through the process, a lot of backwards and forwards. And I'm now 6 months into the process of complaining about KPMG's lack of professionalism to the Institute of Chartered Accountants. I think the overwhelming feeling I have is that just generally not being treated with respect, or just viewed as an annoyance that doesn't really know what they're talking about. I'm a chartered surveyor, and the areas that I was complaining about were within my area of expertise, and a judge has also backed up what I said as one of the residents took Lambeth to tribunal. So I generally was making an objection about governance issues, overpaying contractors, tendering, price fixing as well, and a £70 million overspend on the town hall. They might not necessarily be material in accounting firms, but in the interim, Lambeth, I can quite clearly say I've overpaid their contractors tens of millions of pounds since I brought this objection, because nobody's done anything about it. And I found with the auditors, you would think as a matter of professionalism, even if they didn't want to take court action, or even if they didn't want to issue a public interest report, at the very least you would expect them to pass on my concerns to Lambeth and say, I think you should have a look at this. But no, nothing. So I put my objections in. The auditor from KPMG just rejected them. When I asked him to explain why he'd rejected my objection, he couldn't actually find an answer. So he said, oh, I'll have another look. And he did that to me not once, but twice. So I find it astonishing that he couldn't actually back up his own decision. And I found from asking freedom of information requests that he was actually asking questions of the council after he had rejected my objection. I also found he didn't actually understand the technical aspects of what the question I was asking. It's an area of my particular expertise, and he just clearly just didn't understand. I also found they didn't actually have any sort of policy on public interest reports. So I don't see how, as a practice, you can be consistent without having any kind of policy. So that was 4 years. I went through the complaints process with them. That got nowhere. So I then took my complaint about their behaviour to the Institute of Chartered Accountants. They initially said that they couldn't look at it, they could only look at their professional conduct. So they were basically saying, as long as nobody from KPMG punches me or swears at me, they can't intervene. And they said I needed to complain to the PSAA, who actually told us, well, it's nothing to do with us. And they also peer reviewed KPMG's response to me. So there's a clear conflict of interest there. So I went back to the ICAEW and quoted their code of ethics to them. And that sort of stumped them a bit. So they sort of said, oh, well, maybe we can look at it then. So they've now spent the last 6 months trying to decide whether they can investigate or not. And they're now telling me that they can definitely look at how KPMG have handled my complaint, but they're not sure whether they can look at their overall professional behaviour, because they're saying it might be the FRC. So they don't know themselves. The people who are supposed to be regulating the professional behaviour of these people don't know either. So I'll finish up there. If anybody can actually make sense of this, please tell me, because it's just an absolute mess. Okay, I'll finish up there. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon, for sharing that experience with us. At least I feel like it really brings to life what both Prem and Gillian were talking about that very sort of fragmented oversight structure, or lack of such a thing. Now do still have half an hour for discussion as we wanted to have, so thanks a lot to all the speakers for keeping to time so well. And please do put questions in the chat if you don't want to ask them yourself, or you can also raise your hand from the reactions button in the bottom row of your screen, and then I will call you to come forward to ask your question. And yes, Joel has raised the hand, so Joel, please go ahead.
Thanks, Fanny. So I think my question is primarily for Gillian and for Prem. So I think, I think the common theme we've heard from speakers is a sort of retrenchment of the sort of public functions of accountability and transparency around audit. I guess is kind of, Simon and others have spoken about how that's been kind of transferred to the shoulders of the general public. So I guess my question for you is, how do we go about replacing what was lost by the Audit Commission? What should replace it? In your view, should that be in institutional form, or should that be via empowering the role of citizen auditors, providing more resources, ability for legal challenge, appeals process, that sort of thing? Or do we need a combination of those two approaches?
Thank you, Joel. Before we let Gillian answer, I think it might make sense to highlight that we obviously have been talking mainly about England when we've been talking about private auditors, and it's worth now when we talk about a public auditor and how that should possibly look like, that we also did look at Scotland in our research, and from our experience, Audit Scotland, which is a public institution, has actually not been any more responsive to resident concerns in private audit firms in England, which shows us that a public audit regime doesn't automatically mean that it responds to the public's concerns. So I just wanted to kind of add this into the sort of conversation about how public audit should be conducted, or what kind of principles should underline it, before I pass on to Gillian for an answer. And you're on mute, Gillian.
Right, hopefully unmuted. Thanks for the question, Joel, and thanks for that observation, Fanny. Of course, the audit structures and systems are very different from within Wales and Scotland, etc., from the UK, and you get into another sort of debate about that. I would say, in terms of, there's a role for both, Joel, in relation to having an institutional form, but also in terms of having of public involvement too. I really do think there's a role for both there. One doesn't actually replace the other, and I think they can actually complement one another. The problem with the system at the moment is, as we've heard, it's very difficult to navigate and know, you know, who is responsible and accountable for what. There are a lot of accountability mechanisms there, but where do you actually go? You know, do you apply a scattergun approach or what, or just throw it out there and hope that it'll be picked up by the right body? And this was a worry and it was a concern by the CLG committee back in 2011. So just after the announcement that the Audit Commission was to be abolished. And if you read that report, you will see concerns around public interest reports and the rights of objectors being fully, you know, thought through in terms of the audit process. So one of the areas that I was thinking about in terms of the change, which I didn't get around to sort of outlining, I think whatever audit system is designed, you need to think about it from two perspectives. One, well, not the consumer, the public and the taxpayer. Does this improve accountability for the public and the taxpayer? Can they have a clear line of sight in terms of how to actually have their objections properly heard, and what is the appeals process? But also the other is the courts, in terms of, as I said, when the Audit Commission was there, it would rigorously pursue any potential or illegal activity through the court system. It was never directly accountable to local government. And I think any system, institutional system, should meet both those criteria, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That's really good points. Is there anybody else who'd like to comment on this question? I'm thinking possibly Adam or Prem.
Yeah, I actually agree with what Gillian has just said, and I think it is fundamentally wrong to let trade associations become regulators, which is what the ICAW really is. And I think I've never understood why audit files are not open to taxpayers, citizens to scrutinize. And at the moment, we know very little about how the audit is organized. That is same in the public sector as well as in the private sector. We don't know enough about the composition of the audit team, the time they spend, what key questions they ask, what key replies do they receive. And every time accounts are published with an audit report, I think that should be accompanied by a statement saying what kind of a regulatory action the firm has faced in the last 5 years, and what faults have been found in its audit quality, what shortcomings there have been discovered by the regulator. And that way people can make an informed judgment also about the conduct of the audit. But I think the current arrangements are unsatisfactory, both at the institutional level and at the transparency level. And as Simon indicated, the problems in trying to pursue in this maze about who exactly do you go to. And that problem is not just at the local council audit, it is the same in the commercial sector as well, where people forget it's not just the FRC, there are 4 other auditing regulators too. They call them recognized supervisory bodies. So that maze is still with us. I did ask a regulator who I had discussed these things about who do the local authority auditors owe a duty of care to. I didn't really get a sensible answer. I got the impression that this kind of question was not really welcome, or they hadn't really thought about it, or they rather not say, other than the only reply, which is worth mentioning, was, well, that would be something interesting for the courts to consider. So I'm still puzzled by that. If there is no explicit duty of care, how do you hold the firms to account?
Could I just, it was interesting you mentioned about who the duty of care. I looked at the National Audit Code of Practice, and it does actually say believe it or not, that the auditors work for the public and on the public's behalf, which I find quite incredible given the response. Yeah, that's technically who they report to us, apparently.
Okay.
That's an interesting answer. Would anybody else like to contribute to this? Adam, thinking of you.
Yeah, I mean, I was, you know, as is typical, Prem's unfortunately said everything I was about to say. But I mean, I mean, maybe the one thing that I would be interested, because I mean, these sort of funded projects last 3 years, and if Simon's experience is anything to go by, we're already too late, okay, to file our objections. But you know, what I'd be interested in is, you know, what strategies work there, and what, you know, is this just a slow, laborious process of kind of wearing the institutions down, or did certain tactics and strategies work a little better than others? It's a question, really.
I actually do want to mention here that in our research, we look at objections from a couple of years back, and also People's Audit has obviously been going since 2015. So kind of a lot of the experiences that we refer to relate to objections that are a bit older. But recently, from this year, actually, the NAO Code of Practice does now recommend a 6-month time limit for responding to objections. And we obviously hope that our making noise about this issue has something to do with that recommendation. However, the problem obviously is that there is still no enforcement for if auditors do not respond within those 6 months. But in theory, at least, this problem has been acknowledged, and we are in a way waiting to see with a lot of interest kind of what happens with this new recommendation in place. I would actually be interested if nobody else wants to jump in right now, please do feel free to. Oh, Vika, go ahead.
If I could respond to Adam about tactics that have worked. So in the case of LOBA loans, we use the objection process quite extensively. We supported around 50 objectors across the country, and actually doing it collectively was the most powerful thing that we could do, because it forced both the auditors to talk between them and to talk with the National Audit Office. And so in the case of LOBA loans, even if the objections were being dismissed and no action was taken, the conversations were actually happening within the NAO, and actions were taken. So, however, the Act really does not make this easy, because when objectors receive their response, they're not allowed to make it public or to share it with anyone except for their legal representative. And they could be given like a really, really high fee if they do make it public. So there's nothing that allows for this sort of collective engagement. The other thing that we found that was very interesting, and this we all found it through freedom of information requests, is that once the auditor was made aware of an issue in one council, if they were auditing other councils, so in the case of LOBA loans, if they were auditing other councils that had LOBA loans, the NAO suggested that the other councils, even if they didn't receive an objection. So those are two elements that we found quite interesting and powerful, but obviously all this information was only found out via FOI with central government, rather than communicated directly to the objections.
That's really helpful. Thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Mika. Anybody else?
Just to add to that, I mean, that's one thing that's been lost with the demise of the Audit Commission, because the Audit Commission could look across the piece and share information at a national level. So now you have obviously the fragmentation, so you don't get that level of sharing of information as what you did with the Audit Commission. the other thing that the Audit Commission, thinking about something earlier, Fanny, that they did collect information about public interest reports, the number of objections, what the objections related to, which would actually flag up issues. So that's actually ceased with the Audit Commission. But also in terms of, if you think back to Hammersmith and Fulham, when they were dealing with the global financial markets, it was the Audit Commission's action that stopped that through the courts, but also prevented lots of other local authorities going down that route and losing taxpayers a lot of funds. So it took the action of one, but then applied it across the board nationally. So we're actually missing, when I talked about the system leadership, we're actually missing that as part of the current audit process. So it would negate it, you know, you having to go and get 50 other objectors to object to the same thing happening within their local authorities. So that's just reminded me of a couple of points there.
Thanks, Gillian. And it's also really interesting that you bring in the Hammersmith and Fulham case, because in the work on global loans, which probably not everybody in the room knows exactly what they are, but there's these very toxic long-term loans that hundreds of councils across the UK took out. And we've been looking a lot into that issue, and we've been trying to kind of raise the argument that with the Hammersmith and Fulham case in the late 80s, early 90s, as courts very clearly ruled that councils should not speculate on taxpayer money. Why does that now apply to global loans? And yeah, nobody has been quite willing to take that argument forward, which is interesting in the light of what you raised. I am wondering if anybody would have ideas on how that, oh no, let's go to Adam. Adam's raised his hand.
I was going to raise one additional issue, and this is kind of work that we've partly been involved with, but John Silver here, who's involved in another project on land in Manchester, land disposals in Manchester. And that's, so one of the issues at Manchester, and John can correct me if I'm wrong here, is that, so Manchester, the council values its property in two different ways, depending on whether it's developable land or not. And that classification is crucial as to whether you kind of hold it at a negligible price or a kind of a market-like value, although you can still grant discounts on that if you're selling that land. But Manchester has, on a number of these deals, simply given away that land, or at least leased it on a, on a absolutely negligible, for a negligible amount of money. So I was just wondering whether anyone has had any experience of how the land assets are held by council, and any stories that could be shared in this forum. John, is that right?
If anybody wants to answer or share anything, please just jump in, unmute yourselves and jump in.
No. So I guess that's one we have to, this is another question we have to delicately raise with the council if they ever speak to us ever again. All right.
I just wondered, Fanny, if I could raise the, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
The issue of accountability, and I think that it goes to the media, and it also goes to what happened with the Audit Commission and the district auditors. When the Audit Commission was set up, I mean, one of the reasons for it was that district auditors were seen to get too close to council leaders, and this often led to all kinds of problems. And that was one of the reasons the oversight that the Audit Commission gave was extremely valuable, and as it proved. The other issue is the issue of surcharge. Now, for people who conducted willful misconduct, there was this issue of surcharge, and it cut both ways. For example, you had the issue in Clay Cross in 1973, where a bunch of councillors refused to put up rents in line with government legislation, and they were surcharged for the amount of money that was lost. The same happened in Lambeth a decade later, and in Liverpool, where they refused again to put up rates. They were surcharged for the amount of money that was lost to the what was lost to the ratepayer at that time. And I think a lot of people, I know, talking to Tony Child about this years ago, he thought that was a mistake when I think it was Labour got rid of that power, because I think it was a very great corrective power, and I think it really held people accountable, you know, and the bar was set very high. So it wasn't just for the usual cock-ups, it was for willful misconduct. And I think that was very important. The second thing about it is the media. I mean, what we're seeing now, unfortunately, is the sort of the collapse of local accountability through the collapse of the local media. You don't have local newspapers reporting on council meetings, digging around, finding out stuff about what the local councillors are up to. And it's increasingly more and more that the local source of news, and I never knew why this was allowed to happen, is the local council itself providing its own news sheets free to local people. And I'm not entirely sure why that was ever allowed either, because of course it was allowed because the council felt it should be in charge of local news and not local papers. So I think the issue here, I think accountability is such an overlooked thing, and I think it goes across the board from the media as well as what's happening in terms of how this is monitored by the authorities.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, that's another really crucial point. We have two hands up, Megan and Joel. Megan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure, thank you. Fanny mentioned the white paper that's currently out, Restoring Trust in Audit and Corporate Governance. And she also mentioned that Hardy talks about local audit, I think 2 pages out of 200. And the discussion about local audit in the wider audit reform debate has become smaller and smaller as the reviews have gone on. And I just wondered, I was interested to hear what people thought about why they think that is. And also for anyone that's spent any time looking through that white paper, it would be useful to know which of the proposals they think might be relevant for local audit. Thanks.
Who wants to answer? Why has local audit become a smaller part of the reform agenda as the reviews have gone on, and what should the review agenda be, if that's a fair summary? Prem, please go ahead.
Just give a quick comment. I think obviously audit failures in the private sector had lots of publicity and visibility, and that is where many accounting firms are concentrated and their money is made. They've been startled, worried by the suggestions that the auditors should not be allowed to sell any consultancy service. I did a parallel work to Kingman, Bryden, and the CMA for the Labour Party produced a report where we had said that audit firms should only do audit and absolutely nothing else. I've met partners of maybe the top 20 firms and maybe beyond. I think there was real concern. My God, if Labour comes in power, what's going to happen to our income stream? And I think the government rode to their rescue, mainly coming up with proposals which the firms by and large were comfortable with, but since then they've been even rolling those back. I think generally public sector audits have not really been that visible. We heard about spate scandals in yesteryears, but in recent years they've not really had a lot of visibility. Maybe Labour loans had some visibility, but many others have not, and therefore it is neglected. And when you look at Parliament itself, you find there are, certainly in the Lords where I am, there are individuals who had strong links with the big accounting firms, and they act as kind of internal buffers trying to resist change and protect them. And so I think there are these kind of really factors which meant that this has been invisible. What I will now try to do after this meeting, I will try to table a question about the local council audit, and I will go to Speaker's office hopefully this afternoon, that is online, and see if we can get the Minister to respond to your report. This is by no means guaranteed. You put in question, a lot of people put in question, at the end it's a kind of, if your name comes out of the hat, but it is worth a try. And at the very least, we can seek some ministerial response, though they don't usually reply. Last time I went to the chamber, they said, good news, we have COVID testing facilities. And I said, what about hearing? They said, what do you mean hearing tests? I said, ministers don't answer the questions you ask. And I think they should have a regular hearing test. So just because I might be able to ask a question doesn't mean they will answer, but at least it will put it on the agenda, and some other legislators may be interested in reading the report and thinking about the issues. So I will try that this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Prem. That's yeah, great to even know that you will be putting this matter forward. Joel has his hand up, and Andrew Hill also briefly had his hand up. Joel, do you want to go? Yeah, if both of you go really quickly, and then we just come back to the speakers for answers and final comments, because we only have 5 minutes left.
So mine is a partial response to Adam on the land point. So I think from my perspective, the thing that connects issues around land disposal and how that's done on commercial terms or otherwise, and also why we've ended up with things like PFI contracts at councils and the scale we do, and things like LOBO loans, is a sort of general failure to benchmark the cost of private finance against the sort of public procurement sort of alternative. So how you benchmark accurately the costs of procurement, public versus private. An interesting thing, I think, throughout research on those points has been none of these local authorities have been able to provide any evidence of actually benchmarking the costs of a private finance option against a public finance option across the whole term of a contract. So I think my question for someone like Prem is, how do you force these local authorities to be transparent about this benchmarking process and to do it properly? How do you force them to do that? And what should that process look like?
Apologies, I got to dash off. I'm just getting a message. My next meeting is kicking off 11:30 on the dot. I think really we need far more transparency. That's the kind of in a nutshell, really, Joel. Maybe citizens themselves should have the right to audit local councils, examine their files. To go, because I can see messages flashing. The other side's getting anxious. There's a meeting just kicking off in 3 minutes.
Understandable.
So
thank you ever so much for joining us.
Bye.
Bye. And let's bring in Andrew very briefly. Sorry to have to rush towards the end, but this is always the case, just the conversation starts to get lively. Andrew, briefly, and then speakers for final brief words.
Thank you. It was just a thought about, you briefly mentioned SIP from time to time. And what I often focus on is the Section 114 angle. So there's a sense that one of the questions you were asking was, why is there not much, why are people not particularly aware of it? But some of the statutory warning bells, like Section 114 and Section 25, were changed partly during the COVID period. And the responsibility was moved from the Section 151 financial officer back towards government. So one of the areas I was looking at recently was Slough, and their reserves had fallen to £500,000. And you might think, and I'm interested in opinions, but you might think that would trigger a Section 114 by default, but it doesn't, because of the way in which the government is then involved. So that's the sort of one observation. And I suppose the other main observation about the LAA 2014 would be the difficulty in getting hold of individual contracts and related documents that you highlighted earlier on. I would imagine that by default that should revert to freedom of information requests if they are refused, and then you would have the regulator of FOI to appeal to. But in fact, the sort of guidance on the LA A 2014 suggests that judicial review is the sort of a main approach, and obviously that's a very expensive approach. So I was just curious as whether other people felt there was an interplay there between those two statutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really interesting. Questions. I'm really aware of time, but it would be great to just have very quick final comments from speakers. Adam, let's go to you first, because I know that you also have an appointment at 11:30.
Well, I mean, it's been fascinating today. So, I mean, I've learned a load too. So, if anyone is interested in keeping in touch with the project, then just drop me an email, follow me on Twitter, particularly around things that work, things that don't work, around the objections, or how to get information that might be difficult and hard to track down. But we're at the beginning, and feel free to communicate and keep in touch. Thanks a lot. Gillian, do you want to say a few words, final words?
Yes, I think more than ever, I think just listening to people, what's called for is a whole systems review of audit and governance for local government, because quite clearly there are areas that haven't been sufficiently addressed that do need addressing. And just back to what I said, to think about a system, does it deliver accountability for the public, and are there routes in terms of to pursue through the courts if necessary for potential illegality. That's all I'd say. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Of course, if anybody needs to go at this stage, just thanks very much for attending. But let's ask Andrew and Simon for a brief final comment as well. Andrew, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, just to reiterate what I said before, I think local government finances has been likened to the Schleswig-Holstein question that Bismarck said only 3 people understood. One's dead, one went mad, and the other one's forgotten what the question is. And I think it's such a complicated issue that I think there should be more, information given to the public about what their councils are up to and how they can challenge them and hold them to account. I think that would be that would be a sort of campaign that I think would be very valuable, because I think there's so much ignorance about what the people's local councils are up to for all the reasons we discussed this morning, that more needs to be done, I think, to inform the public about their rights, because so few people know what they are.
Yes, that's what we are working towards. Simon, do you want to say anything to wrap up?
I just repeat what Gillian said, really. The system is so broken, and it's not just the internal audit, it's actually, the external audit. It's what we found as well, it's the internal audit. A lot of these issues that citizen auditors are picking up are things that the internal audit should be picking up themselves. But I think you have to be in for the long haul, and eventually, this stuff is going to bubble to the surface. So the day of reckoning will come at some stage.
Thank you, everybody, for attending us. Sorry for running over by a couple of minutes, but it easily happens when you have such an interesting conversation. And it's been really, really, really insightful. And we will definitely keep working on this. And it's great to always see people who are also working on these quite neglected issues. So let's definitely keep in touch. And thank you, everyone, for great contributions and questions.